Welcome to this webinar of the RAI, which is the first one in our anthropological responses to COVID-19 series. So in the coming weeks, we will have more events on that. Please check our website for the other ones to come. I'm starting with a little bit of housekeeping here, just to get you acquainted with the webinar. We have two RAI staff here. That's me, Haneen, and my colleague, Emma.
Hi, everybody.
So Emma will be checking the chat box for all your technical questions. The timing of the event is so that first Professor Daniel Miller will speak for half an hour, then we'll have 15 minutes Q&A just for his presentation, and then we'll switch over to the presentation of Dr. Kehinde Adepegba, and that should be around 3:55, and then we will have another 15 minutes of Q&A after that, and after those we have another 20 minutes of general Q&A as well. So just as a heads up for how today will run. And we may not be able to answer all questions. Usually we get so many questions, we can't just do all of them. But if you have a burning question afterwards, you can send it to info@therai.org.uk. I will receive it and I can distribute it to the speaker. If there's anything else, send us an email. I will hand over now to our chair and the director of the Royal Anthropological Institute, David Shankland.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, if it's afternoon where you are, otherwise good morning or good evening. It's a great pleasure to see you all here. Just a few notes about the RAI. The RAI is open to everyone. If you wish to join us, then please do. We only really, because we have fellows. We get no money at all from any government source. We're a completely individual organization. You're most welcome. Please do glance at the website. And also just to note that we are having a very major conference, a virtual conference called Anthropology and Geography, for which the timetable has just gone up this morning. So if you might at all be interested in that, it takes place between the 14th and the 18th of September. Again, please just look at our website and the conferences, and it will be a pleasure to have you with us. Today, the first of our COVID-19 seminars, after we had an introductory roundtable last week, really is important because we have two extremely distinguished and committed, and I can say even lively speakers who have made an enormous contribution. Danny Miller, in particular, is well known for his very early commitment to the kind of virtual seminar, the virtual transmission of information that we're having today. In order not to take up any more time, we'll pass straight away then to our first speaker, Professor Miller, who will give a presentation for half an hour. If you have any questions, please just fire them in and we'll do our best to answer them later on. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much for a kind invitation to address this. I mean, we're dealing with a plague, and it's one that has brought immense suffering, both directly in the mortality figures and often indirectly, as for example, in the repressive response described in last week's seminar for Uganda. But I'm going to suggest that even the darkest of storm clouds may have a sliver of silver lining, because I believe that the events of the last few months also act as a vindication of the discipline of anthropology, of who we are and of what we do. Unfortunately, this does not detract at all from the plague, but it is important to us. There are many ways you can characterize anthropology, many ways, but I'm going to suggest there are 4 things contemporary anthropologists would say do pretty well. First, we continue to insist on cultural relativism. Second, we excavate ideologies that people take for granted. Third, we examine the consequences of structural power. And fourth, we bring to the foreground the agency of often ordinary, often neglected people. And I will argue that this plague has demonstrated the contemporary importance of anthropology with respect to all 4 of these tasks. Now, half an hour is possibly not really enough to do this, so actually it's a paper really in 2 halves. And I'm going to give the second part at the ASA workshop in August. What I'm going to do there is look at the evidence for the 4th point, the response of ordinary people. But today, what I'll try and do is tackle the first 3 elements within anthropology. Now, the background to this was a kind of coincidence, really. Before the pandemic came on the scene, I'd been working as part of a team of 11 researchers in a project called ASA, the Anthropology of Smartphones and Smart Aging. And all but one of these ethnographies finished around about a year ago. So back in London, we were gathered together to consider our findings. And one section of these findings was given the overarching label that there is a fine line between care and surveillance. The conclusion came from many of our individual ethnographies. Our project examined smartphones mainly in relation to the consequences to older people and also for health. But often the people some of us were working with, say in their like 60s, may have had elderly parents in their 90s who are now frail and needed considerable care. On the one hand, the smartphone hugely developed the capacity for care. Sure, you recognize that when somebody is gravely ill, it seems like the first response is to create a WhatsApp group to organize care by family and friends. Care can be expressed now over a distance for people living in other countries. Our projects in China and Japan examine the use of visual elements to express affection and consideration, such as short health videos through WeChat or stickers through Line, sometimes overcoming the etiquettes and the formalities of face-to-face encounters. But at the same time, these elderly recipients of care are often very well aware that this also constitutes surveillance. They are greatly concerned about their autonomy, their dignity, and they are often adamant about not wanting to be a burden. So as a result, we're constantly observing that one effect of smartphones was this kind of growing consciousness that it brings both this enhanced capacity for care and surveillance, and there is a fine line between them. But then there's no reason to think this is particularly true of older people. What parent does not believe that monitoring the smartphone of their 12-year-old is simply an expression of care? And what 12-year-old does not believe that that very same action is an act of surveillance? It's also hardly new. One definition of a god is that being who sees everything and cares for everybody. So just as we started to write about this, along comes the pandemic. And suddenly our observation becomes the world's observation. Surveillance was already at the forefront of social science, following the revelations of Edward Snowden, Cambridge Analytica, the recent book on surveillance capitalism. We already knew that smartphones could take surveillance by both states and companies to a whole new level. I mean, anthropologists generally are brought up on, Bentham's Panopticon, Foucault, and a long tradition of exposing surveillance. And we're also well aware that smartphones are growing apace. A report today suggests that WhatsApp use grew by 40% worldwide during the pandemic. But I think this has now reached a kind of public crescendo in discussions in particular of the role of smartphones as vehicles for contact tracing apps. These apps are being introduced pretty much everywhere. They contain the capacity to automatically register other people within Bluetooth range by gathering data on those people's smartphones. I would say right now, most of the reporters suggest that these apps are actually not especially effective and that personal interviews are probably more important. Although I have seen some science papers, including one actually in the journal Science, that seem to suggest that maybe they have been reasonably effective, especially when combined with other surveillance tools such as CCTV and credit card information, as was practiced, for example, in South Korea. Now, there are different versions of these apps, and this has led to some rather delicious ironies in the last month or so. The critic Morozov declared that the combination of Apple and Google in developing their version of this app was a marriage made in hell. Yet we discovered recently that it's this commercial app that is actually much more preserving of privacy, since it is based on decentralized information collecting held on the smartphones. By comparison, the UK's so-called NHS app would have been based on centralized information collecting, which is why a few weeks ago, the UK had to give up on the NHS app and is now developing a local version of the Apple Google app, partly on grounds of privacy protection. Though if you looked at, say, yesterday's Guardian, you could see why we might be a little concerned that it is Apple and Google power that now protects our privacy. But as I said, there seem to be some pretty weird counterintuitive developments going on out there. Now, to be honest, I personally haven't a clue if these apps are effective or not. But what I'm interested in is the debate around their deployment. And this brings me to my first vindication of anthropology. The technology itself is a universal. I guess either smartphones can do this stuff or they can't. And potentially it can do it one place, I guess it can do it in most. But the response to this potential capacity has been anything but universal. You really couldn't have had a more diversified reaction. It's like no two countries seem to have proceeded in exactly the same way. The reason, I think, is pretty obvious, because of course it is never just technology. The possible deployment of this app brings to the world's attention this very same conclusion, that there is a fine line between care and surveillance. The more care, the more surveillance. So that the attitude to this prospect is always a reflection of cultural values. The spectrum goes from South Korea to US Republicans. South Korea is probably the case, might be others, where the stress has been clearly on the idea of a collective social good, favouring overall care at the expense of individual privacy. Now, actually, that was something evident long before this pandemic. Not sure if everyone recalls, but I do, the famous dog poo incident in 2005, when someone took a picture of a stranger whose dog was fouling the pavement, and this picture went viral in South Korea in order to shame the dog owner. The media over here is fascinated by the breaches of privacy. The first wave of contact tracing, I think, exposed somebody having an affair. The second exposed someone going to a stigmatized gay club. In one case, the contact tracing managed to track 16,000 people that might have been associated with one building that was infected. But what has also been clear is that this seems to be generally acceptable to a large part of the South Korean population. The privacy breaches seem to be seen as relatively trivial if the overall result is that the population as a whole doesn't have to suffer the confinement of lockdown, and they reduce the overall level of fatalities. The evidence for that, apart from reports from local anthropologists, is that an election was held during this period, which resulted in a landslide victory for the priorities of the government. But South Korea is just one case. Each region has its own response. Sweden, in fact, seems to have sort of fetishized its own belief in its own consensual politics to go its own way. The response of US Republicans would be probably the other end of the spectrum from South Korea in terms of how people would see this balance between state surveillance that they are very concerned about as against the priority of defending individual rights. But even within East Asia, South Korea seems to have been entirely different from China, and both are very different from Japan. In some countries, the media tell us that very few people downloaded the apps when they were present, sometimes despite government pressures. Case actually I've been able to find relatively little information about so far is India, which was interesting because the local contact tracing app was downloaded 100 million times in 40 days. To put that in perspective, that's faster than Pokemon Go. So, our first conclusion is that the fine line between care and surveillance has led to a vindication of anthropology by exposing the degree to which what matters most is not technology, but local cultural values, and these have been revealed in all their heterogeneity. Which is the discipline that is dedicated to documenting the diversity and comparative study of such cultural values? Well, that would be anthropology. So I would argue in this debate, we really matter. I have, however, been using the term cultural values somewhat glibly so far. So first to say, in the tradition of us, I guess, structural anthropology, when we talk about such values, we're not obviously talking about something homogeneous, but usually a spectrum of oppositions. I guess if you're talking about, I know, the US cultural values, it's got to be the opposition between Democrat and Republican, not one or the other. But I also want to suggest that a deeper appraisal brings out the next two vindications of anthropology: the way we expose ideology and the way we try and excavate the consequences of structural power. To take ideology first, let me start by saying I take us as all equally ideological. So any excavation has to be committed to exposing our own ideologies as well as that of others. So what contribution does anthropology make to understanding ideology in respect to this fine line between care and surveillance? Well, once again, I think our ASA project possibly had a kind of head start because we were already doing just that through our work on smartphones. An example would be the excellent report by one of our team, Xinyuan Wang, published in The Conversation. Now, as the London Review of Books recently noted, perhaps the most extreme example of state surveillance prior to the pandemic was the Chinese social credit system. Under the system, any behavior the state regards as antisocial or anti-state can result in citizens losing their ability to book flights or high-speed trains, as well as making them subject to many other curtailments. What had been lacking is a sense of how the Chinese population feel about this system, which therefore became a component of Xinyuan's research. She focuses on three reasons why, in many cases, the system turned out to be actually quite a popular development. The first was the overall shift from an agrarian economy, where people generally at least knew the reputation of pretty much everyone they dealt with on a personal level, and trust was based on social relations. Think the concept of guanxi. For them, surveillance was a response to the massive rise in fraud and deception that followed the shift to a more anonymous urban society. It was also based on a myth about credit rating in the West, and was related to traditional cosmologies based on Taoism, the idea that the sky, Tian, sees all our behavior and good fate depends on good deeds. Point though is that none of these have very much to do with the Communist Party's own narrative and own legitimation of the system. One would have to excavate then, use anthropology to understand the underlying ideologies in history, both with respect to the population and with respect to the government. And we will come to the difference between these two later. What would be the equivalent exercise here? I suggest that would involve exposing our own current attitude to privacy as ideology. I believe that attitudes to privacy have radically changed in the last few decades to become what I am now going to call a neoliberal cult. Now, I know the word neoliberal is supposed to be used as a synonym for a version of capitalism. But in a kind of way, I think that's rather a pity, because it's actually a rather more literal description of our privacy cult. Because this seems to stem from the sort of classic liberal ideal that each individual has an axiomatic right to control what is known about them. In its neo form, it takes different directions. In Europe, this has been mainly through bureaucratization, as in developments such as data protection and GDPR. While in the US, it's more an overt belief system of US Republicans seen as enshrined in constitutions preserving the absolute right of the individual against the state. Unfortunately, things are not very easy even to talk about, because as I'm sure you're aware, in the US, the term liberal currently seems to be used to mean two totally opposite things at the same time. So just to be clear, what I'm referring to is the historical idea of prioritizing the individual as against the state. Now, I call this ideology because I feel that the people around me increasingly take this as axiomatic, as though it is a natural right, as though it couldn't possibly be otherwise. Yet I was brought up in a more, I guess, socialist environment, which would probably have asserted the interests of the state as against this liberal individualism. And I admit, I find the rather vehement way it is defended as problematic. Everybody, including myself, is for privacy. But in my case, only up to the point where I believe it does harm. My most recent book, which was called The Comfort of People, argued that this obsession with privacy actually does considerable harm to the patients in a hospice with terminal diagnosis who I was working with, since it curtailed the necessary circulation of medical information. In my most recent ethnography in Ireland, I found it was also curtailing the work of voluntary groups who no longer can even cope with the associated bureaucracy. Closer to home, I recall decades ago in anthropology, when we used to talk about ethics, I felt those used to be like sensitive investigations into actually what we mean by harm. Harm when working as ethnographers, and what we then do to prevent that. But maybe I'm exaggerating, but today all I ever seem to get when I'm giving papers are questions about consent forms and privacy, as though all populations must have the same overriding prioritization with privacy that we do now. Yet in this extreme form, it is quite possible that ethnography itself has already become a semi-illegal practice that is only protected by fudging what is involved. So I worry that this cult may lead to the abolition of anthropology. Yet as ideology, it is now seen as something like a natural human right we are simply bound to concur with. Fortunately, you don't need to agree with a word of what I just said, because my only point with respect to this paper is that this represents the second vindication of what anthropologists do. Anthropologists just don't just talk of a fine line between care and surveillance. We strive to also excavate the underlying ideologies that help explain why different populations might have quite different responses to where the balance between care and surveillance would actually be found. Now, I said earlier that the term cultural values can be rather glib. Examining underlying ideologies may help to deepen our understanding of what supports this term. But I think my third area of vindication adds much more to this. Here I refer to the work of anthropology in tackling structural power. Structural power implies asymmetries of power that are either embedded in structures such as institutions or in the structure of society itself, as implied by terms such as white privilege. Structural power has to be central, I think, to any survey of the response to COVID-19, such as I'm attempting here. And the reason was actually very clear in last week's webinar. This included discussion of the highly repressive responses that can be observed in Uganda and elsewhere. It's something we can also attest to because Charlotte Hawkins, who's one of the ASA teams, is working in a low-income area of Kampala. Now, as anthropologists, we would certainly hope that no one would ever suggest that this repressive response by the Ugandan state in any way reflects Ugandan or Acholi or indeed Ugandan cultural values. What this represents is structural power. So one of the things that anthropology must seek to develop in dealing with the response to this pandemic is precisely the differentiation of whatever it is that we might mean by cultural values as opposed to structural power, although sometimes they're the same. One reason this is singularly important takes us back to the case of China. The Chinese government has developed a huge propaganda campaign over its successful suppression of COVID-19. It claims that this is the clearest ever evidence for the superiority of certain Chinese values as embodied by the state. Yet, as Xinyu and Wang showed earlier, the way ordinary people view developments such as the social credit system may actually have very little to do with the way the state portrays them. The Chinese state is then exploiting these events to affirm its authoritarian nature and as what it claims is a benign, paternalistic party state. Its achievement was in keeping deaths to 3 in a million. Of course, what never gets mentioned is that simultaneously Taiwan, using democratic and consensual methods, did 10 times better, with a death rate of 0.3 in a million. If we survey more widely, we can see it's just too easy to elide structural power with these cultural values. And partly that is because the relationship between the two is so diverse and complex and would require several other papers. As previously noted, the Swedes seem, at least at first, genuinely supportive of the contention that their state's policy was specifically Swedish, while the South Koreans affirm their support for prioritizing surveillance over individual privacy in an election. But with populist politicians such as Bolsonaro, Trump, and Johnson, their mega strategy is to make claims to represent the true but now downtrodden voice of popular values. The pandemic reveals both how hollow these claims are and how inept such populist politicians tend to be in practice, to our cost. The problem is that most information, most of what I'm using here, comes from the news. And when we listen to the news about local responses to COVID-19, journalists tend to refer to national governments and their policies rather than actual populations. The state stands as proxy for the people. So it's clearly then one of the key tasks of anthropology to refute the idea that states necessarily represent the people they rule. And instead, it is anthropologists who've always tried to expose the workings and consequences of structural power, including the way states make claims that we want to contest with regard to who they represent. Now, as it happens, the means by which anthropologists would achieve this goal would then lead quite naturally to my fourth and final way in which I think the study of this pandemic acts as a vindication of anthropology. Early on, the Centre for Digital Anthropology at UCL created a website, and it's called anthrocovid.com, one word, anthrocovid.com. In the many reports published on this website, anthrocovid.com, you can see how it is anthropologists who focus on the local agency and the response of people themselves rather than the claims of the state as reported in the news. And I strongly urge you, if you're interested to know how anthropologists can contribute to issues raised by COVID-19, then spend some time going to the anthrocovid.com. This was a kind of citizen science project. Anybody from anywhere has been asked if they want to contribute, and I think there's now over 100 reports from anthropologists all around the world, and basically documenting what is going on at this kind of local level. So the fourth and final task is of turning attention to actual populations and not the state as proxy. And that would then help complete the task I've been outlining of how we understand the way structural power and cultural values interlock, but can also be differentiated. Now, that final section is what I really want to present at the ASA workshop, which is basically on the same subject as these series, taking place in August. And what I want to concentrate on there are the anthropological studies represented by things like the anthrocovid.com website, and also reflecting on my own recent ethnography in Ireland, and the way these bring to the fore the reactions of ordinary people to the pandemic and leads to this fourth vindication for anthropology. But let me just conclude with a summary of where the paper's gone so far. My argument is that even prior to the pandemic, it was becoming clear from our research just how far smartphones extend the capacity for care and the capacity for surveillance. This led to our conclusion within ASA that this produces the problem we can characterize as the fine line between care and surveillance, because they're usually two sides of the same coin. But precisely because that is the case, it has produced an effect that vindicates the discipline of anthropology itself. This was based on characterizing anthropologists as engaged in 4 particular tasks, though of course there are many others. The first was the emphasis on cultural relativism, and cultural relativism has been vindicated by the evidence that this shift in technological capacity built into the various versions of the smartphone contact tracing app in the last few months has elicited an extraordinarily diverse set of responses in terms of the possibilities of their deployment, because the balance between care and surveillance is not a matter of technology, but of cultural values. The shift in the UK from the NHS app, the Apple Google app, is something you could certainly look at from that perspective. Second claim concerned the anthropologist's ability to excavate the underlying ideologies that people naturalize, I assume to be simply an unchangeable state of affairs. In this case, through on the one hand, an examination of surveillance systems, such as the social credit system in China, but also what I call the neoliberal cult of privacy, as it has become embedded as ideology amongst ourselves, i.e. the idea that individual privacy is paramount and foundational to liberal ideology. My third point was that when we survey responses to the virus, we have a problem, since we would like to talk about cultural values, for example, as complex structural oppositions, but the news focuses on national government policies, often of repressive states, that actually signify structural power. And it is the anthropologists that strive to ensure the differentiation between these. Fortunately, both the study of structural power and the focus on ideology help ensure that terms such as cultural values remain complex and contextual rather than glib. Now, as I said, I've left to one side the fourth element that I think would contribute to all kind of three, and actually in a way is perhaps at the heart of who we are and what we do, which is working with ordinary people and striving to move their stories and their struggles from the background to the foreground of characterization and debates. I'm going to deliver that under the title of The Good Citizens of COVID-19. However, fortunately, I think this is also likely to be the area that is encompassed by our second paper today, which I look forward to hearing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Danny, for an absolutely marvellous paper. It was a great privilege to hear that. I've got one question actually, which we might just start with, whether you can just in simple one word headings, as it were, summarize the 4 again, just to help those perhaps who are taking notes of your seminar. Okay. Just go bang, 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 bang.
Cultural relativism, exposing ideology, structural power, and the responses of ordinary people.
There. Splendid. Thank you very much. I was very, very struck by the point that you made that anthropology is fast becoming almost an illegal thing to do. Could you perhaps very briefly expand on that? Because I'm sure many people here will be worried about exactly that point that you raise.
Yeah, I think that we really have a very serious, I don't like to use the word existential, but it is a threat to our very being, I think, in some ways, as anthropologists, that we are finding that the bureaucratization and the regulations are making it really difficult to justify the informal practices that we believe are the only way to gain an authentic sense of what is actually going on out there, which cannot be regulated into kind of formal methods that fit these structures. And so there's a kind of danger that, if you like, the baby of anthropology gets flushed away with the bathwater of GDPR. And speaking as an anthropologist, I don't want to go down no plug hole without kind of kicking and screaming as babies do. So I do think this is something that has to be challenged, and it is necessary for us. But the point is, it's not just about the self-interest of anthropologists, although that is there. It is also because of anthropology is a discipline that can do the job of demonstrating how ideology works, how these things get taken up and then assumed to be, as I said, axiomatic. And that classic phrase in ideology, naturalized. So this is a natural condition of being. There could be no other way to think about things other than the way that we hear about through these processes. And I guess it's only because I'm older and I remember a time that I think was before that, that you sort of, I look at this and think it's weird, right? So I think increasingly people see this simply as naturalized. So that, I think, is another part of the contribution of anthropology.
Well, thank you very much. That leads us very, very nicely into the questions here, which there's one from Evelyn and one from Mai, which are connected. So one of them, so Evelyn wonders how you managed to put a team to look into COVID research into place so quickly, and what the most difficult thing has been about that. And Mai asks the related point, which was what do you find novel about conducting online ethnography before and after COVID-19, and indeed whether COVID-19 itself will change the way that we do our research?
Yes, I mean, thanks for the question. I think that if you look at the anthrocovid.com, which has 100 different reports of anthropologists talking about this, mostly, not entirely, but mostly, it represents a transformation in anthropology itself, which way before this pandemic was already a result of the rise of digital technologies. And the point is that we no longer leave the field. We used to, wherever you were, you took a flight back, and that was pretty much, you couldn't keep in contact. But now it would be very strange to suddenly lose contact with people who've now become your friends, and et cetera, in ethnography. So it's not actually, this keeping in touch with the response to COVID-19 was not at all artificial. I mean, I would think, ethnographer, I mean, we had just finished our work across these various sites. Of course, we are really concerned about what is going on in our sites. We want to know we just want to know they're okay. We want to know how people are. We want to, and also we do passionately want to bring their stories to attention, because of the points I was making, that with all this kind of news, it's at such a level that you don't necessarily get to hear what it actually feels like to have this experience of lockdown in countries that are just not designed for lockdown, and all these other elements that are crucially important. So the point about the digital connections is it means that you were in any case in continued contact, and that the COVID-19 would, I think, just naturally have brought you into further contact in order to understand. But from that, of course, you gain knowledge, as you did in your original ethnography, and this is what is really being reported. In other cases, some of the people contributing to COVID are actually still in their ethnographic field sites, and that in some ways probably doesn't make much difference, because if they're having to contact through Zoom anyway, you might as well be, as it were, anywhere. Was there a second part of that question?
Did you find any aspects of COVID-19 research particularly challenging, or was it all absolutely straightforward?
I think it's different, because I do think, I mean, I've always somebody who's never wanted to do just online ethnography. I think you can, and I did a video recently for PhD students who can't get to the field about how and why I think it is possible to be engaged with people. But I think it does require that kind of long-term relationship that you build up over the 60 months. I don't think digital should ever be regarded as a kind of shortcut. I think the problem for COVID is not actually, I mean, our problems are trivial. The problems are the problems that the people we're talking to face. The problems of anxiety, of abuse, of illness, of, the confronting what it is that is actually going on out there and often unreported, and that makes one very, very concerned. I think, forget about us and methods, that to me is the problem right now that we need to be focusing on and trying to give some assistance towards.
Mm. Yes, thank you. And several people are asking, do you think we can do anthropology these days without digital anthropology, turning it the other way around? I mean, this is something, of course, you specialise in.
I think that there has always been specialist anthropology. So people did the anthropology of work and never went to the home of those people. I always thought that was kind of a bit unfortunate, because I tend to be I tend to talk of ethnography as holistic contextualization. I think you need to know a little bit about everything going on in order to understand one. But there is a very strong tradition of anthropology that is topic focused and isn't necessarily holistic in that way. So if you did work before and you didn't do the wider social context, I guess you can continue to do that, or some other subject. But because I tend towards this holistic contextualization as my sense of what ethnography is and what makes it work well, because you don't understand one context without seeing the other. Everything is, as Balance of Learning said, everything is the context of everything else. So I personally think that because so much of this stuff online is so important to people, it's their family discussions, it's their intimate discussions, it's really important. And I would go further than that. I think one, I talked about 4 contributions. I think there's a 5th contribution from anthropologists here, which is that as, I talked about WhatsApp increasing 40% during the pandemic, but WhatsApp is a private, it's where people are often talking about the things that are actually quite intimate and difficult for them. And the only people who would ever have access to that, other than those involved, would be anthropologists who've developed the friendships and trusts. And if we don't see those things, we are not actually appreciating the way people themselves are responding and sharing and communicating and debating what is actually going on around them. So obviously, I would favour anthropologists being as engaged as they possibly can with people at the level where people are themselves having those experiences and expressing their sense of what's going on. And that now is often in the digital domain, though of course not only that.
Yes, thank you. And if we then again turn that upside down in a way, how can we take our insights that we've got from working with people who are not at the forefront necessarily and turn them into publicly engaged scholarship? I mean, how does one engage with polity, which of course is, again, all your insights will be very, very useful for all of us listening, I'm sure.
I mean, that's exactly what we want to do right now, which is both with regard to our ethnographic projects and also with regard to this. And as in my social media project, I mean, one of the things we've done is we try and convey things in very straightforward English. We are prepared to compromise by writing little bullet points. And actually, I mean, I don't think you can engage unless you are prepared to do those compromises, to translate your material effectively into a different language. There are different components of things like policy and also popular education, and they are written in a different way. And if you're not prepared to actually literally rewrite your material in the genres that work in these different areas, I don't think you'll get hold. But right now, of course, I mean, we were waiting until we had, now I said over 100, something like 100 responses to COVID. Now what we're trying to do is contact the intermediaries. So you go to something like The Conversation and hope that they will then bring you to the attention of the wider press. If you are involved in that, one of the points is there are many anthropologists now involved in policy. And in practice, I think it's often the case that we tend to go to, sometimes people we taught who now have jobs there and use networks like that to try and say, do you realize that you can get a sense of other things that are going on through this kind of information, and trying to get things out as wide as possible. So I think it is, what you can't do is simply write something up as an anthropologist, give it out there and think somebody's going to take a blind bit of notice if they're not an anthropologist, because they probably won't. I think it's all about, it is very hard work to do that act of dissemination and actually try and get yourself heard in those areas. But then again, there are senior anthropologists, I'm saying not one of them, but who really do have the ear of people at high level. And again, you network through them. So it is that kind of, it's that networking, it's the styling, etc. But it is a huge task in and of itself. But I do think it's one we should be committed to. We think what we've got to say is important, and it's equally important that the appropriate people get to hear it.
Thank you. We're almost out of time for this section, but there's one other very good question here from someone who would rather withhold their name. And they ask, well, what do we do about the vast parts of the world at the moment that are becoming inherently dangerous for us to work in, inherently dangerous for the people who are living there, and the people living there may indeed have very unequal access to digital technologies in the first place. So in other words, what do we do about working in asymmetric authoritarian contexts?
I think that we have a responsibility, a specific responsibility to that situation. In other words, if you believe that one of the things anthropology does is bring stories and struggles that are essentially suppressed. But again, I would say, I was just looking at the post on Anthro-COVID today. One of them is on Rohingya migrants and the way they are being treated by Malaysian authorities, and the fact that nobody is listening to the conditions of what's going on there. Another was about migrant workers in Singapore and the way the government is stopping researchers trying to get engaged with them. There are limits. If somebody is out of contact and there's no digital connection and you cannot be there, there's no magic wand I can present that will overcome the physical impossibilities of contact. But in as far as we can, what I would say is that's exactly what I see anthropologists trying to do. It is an expression that they do care and that they do feel that this should be a prioritization. So the bulk of the stories that you're seeing coming out right now are stories that I think actually started with that sensibility that unless somebody actually does this work, that will not be heard and will not be known about.
Well, thank you. That's absolutely marvelous. So thank you. Now we turn now to the second speaker of the day before we go back for a general discussion at the end. And it's a very, very great pleasure to welcome Kehinde Adepegba, who joins us from Lagos. And Kehinde is an artist, an activist, an author, an organizer of artist collectives, and has made an enormous contribution really in the creation of capacity, you can say, in public art. So we're very, very pleased to have Kehinde with us, and we invite him now to offer his presentation. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Welcome to my presentation. My topic this afternoon is COVID-19, visual expressions of social demands of coronavirus in Nigeria. And this is something that is going to explore how people and artists try to express themselves on the issue of coronavirus. Now, we all know that COVID-19 is a scourge and has ravaged all the countries all over the world. Over 200 countries are involved. And there is no doubt that there is an economic, political, social, and medical crisis as a result. When you talk about economic situation, we have a lot of people that have lost their job, especially where we have so many informal sectors. So there is a lot of job lost. Politically, there is a lot of issues between governors and president over policy regarding the COVID-19. There are social problems where we can no longer gather together to do things that are usual to us. The unusual are now the usual. As a result, the government all over are trying to mutate the coronavirus by saying that we should keep our distances, we should wash our hands regularly with soap and perhaps alcoholic-based sanitizer, and lockdown has also been employed in order to effect stay at home, as you know. And of course, where there is a good, flattening of the curve, there is also introduction of ease of lockdown, where compulsory use of face masks is done. But you also understand that mutating measures has led to a lot of change that are not desirable, a lot of change that are not we are not familiar with, and they pose a lot of demand on us. As a result, people are trying to express how this demand affects them. And I have looked at how artists respond, how non-artists also respond through visual and textual means. And you will recall that during the lockdown, especially, there is no channel of communication, since you cannot interact with your own people. And the platform, the social media network became very viable as means of expression. Therefore, I have chosen to look at some selected expressions via Facebook posts that really dwell on the crisis and how people are trying to cope with the crisis. Let me start from the first one, and that is expression of the future. This artist, Ikorodu Collins, in an artwork that he did in 2019 October, even before the first case of coronavirus in China, he depicted a man that he referred to as Cosmic Man. And this man was depicted as personifying coronavirus without him knowing that something like that was going to happen. And this man was in an active position of squatting and with regular head prongs. And you can see that there's no doubt that this man saw tomorrow. Even in October, he saw what was going to happen. And you can see the prongs on the head of the man. They are of different shapes, irregular shapes. And this is showing the fact that this coronavirus in some places are very serious, and in some other places are not as serious. And the length of time in some places are shorter, in some places they are longer. So this man expressed how he saw the future. Then we look at this one. It is an expression of uncertainty. This is by Barak Elezioni. Barak Elezioni was expressing uncertainty as a result of non-availability of vaccine and drug of choice for treating coronavirus. In this part of the world, we believe in the gods. The gods do usually speak. And when the gods are silent, it means that there is no way forward. And in this case, this man showing a diviner who is trying to receive from the gods, and the gods are not speaking. And that is laying emphasis on the fact that there is no drug, there's no treatment, and it is giving us a state of uncertainty. This artist, John Adele, is trying to use his artwork to explain social distancing guideline. And by doing this, what he does is to gather vehicle parts and arrange them, assemble them in some ways to show how you should distance. And if you look at this place, these ones are clusters of people gathering together, while these ones are distancing from them. And it's trying to let us know the difference between clustering together and distancing. And it says that the wise will distance. And using vehicle part is trying to show how people are usually moving. There's always activity going on. People are very active. But when you are active, you should be sure that you are keeping distance. That's the expression that this man is getting across to us. This is another one, and I title it Expression of an Act of Corruption. You can see that Bolugu was trying to let us realize that this man is keeping social distance, and that is even when he's taking a bribe from the bicycle rider. I mean, the motorcycle rider. Motorcycle rider here is a local transporter. He moves people from place to place. And the two of them are conscious of the issue of coronavirus. They kept distance. And the man, I mean, the police has devised a means by which he collects a bribe from the rider. And this is just an example of the kind of corruption that has followed the issue of corruption. I mean, the issue of COVID-19. If you look across, in fact, in some places, governors and presidents, they are fighting over a fund to be used to manage coronavirus. And we learned that in some places, they increase the number in order to get more funds. So this is just a micro aspect of the corruption. There's a bigger one, even among the people that are trying to manage coronavirus pandemic. Here we have an expression of challenge of social change. Here, the artist is trying to communicate the fact that the new method that is now being introduced, the new learning method, cannot really work because there is already social inequality and there is poverty among the people. Imagine this kind of a student. How do you expect the student to have access to telephone, I mean, a smartphone or tablet or even a computer? And even when there is all of this, there's no regular power in some cases, and the parent would rather choose to buy food than buy data or to buy other things that we use for this alternative. So it's a challenge, even though this is a change that is being advocated, but it's a great challenge. Another one is the fact that we are people that are used to gathering together. And now we are looking at how the man, the artist, Jim Lukman, tried to express the fact that this social distancing is depriving us of our social gathering. The image projects the inability to join loved ones. Now loved ones who are doing birthday party, who are doing other ceremonies, you cannot join them, and you can only do some of these things on Zoom, and it's not the way we are. The usual is no longer the usual. The unusual is now the new usual. So it's expressing the fact that this used to be the way it is, that a lady would dress gorgeously and would be ready for a weekend party. So the social interaction, the social cohesion is being affected by the presence of COVID. And this is what this artist is trying to express. Here, there is an expression of alternative response and therapy. And the artist who posted this is looking at the fact that we should not be looking at medical science as the only way out to solving the problem of COVID-19. There should be other alternatives, especially in Africa. We should have African solution to the virus. There are other problems that have been created as a result of this COVID-19. There perhaps will be need for rehabilitation, there will be need for psychological treatment, and even spiritual treatment. And we should not only look at the medical science alone. So the man is expressing the fact that there should be an alternative response to the therapy. This is an expression of unusual warning. It's an expression of unusual warning. And Chike Ofili, who did this, is trying to use the image to give a very extreme kind of warning to the people about the fact that COVID-19 is very dreadful. I mean, it's very deadly. And you can see that this is extreme, and it's like a threat that if you stay at home, or you stay at home, or you stay inside this. We know this is a coffin, and this is showing that the only option is to stay at home or die. Even though this looks extreme, but the fact remains that people can go to any extent to pass the message of how deadly the coronavirus is, or how deadly any other disease is, at least to pass the message that one should be very, very careful. So this is an expression of an unusual warning, and is trying to help people to heed to all the guidelines that has been given. This is expression of creativity. I have 4 in this category, and what we have here is a designer, fashion designer, who tries to express himself by making a unique face cover. You know, during this period, the cost of medical face mask went up, and this one is innovative enough, apart from the fact that it can be washed, it can be reused, it is cheaper. And what this is saying is that when there is a social problem, it gives room for ingenuity, and this is one of the things that can be done. So the person that posted this is trying to intimate the people or his friends on Facebook about how creativity can lead to and solve problems. And this is another expression of creativity. As you can see, this is a picture of Mona Lisa. Mona Lisa is one of the most popular paintings in the world. It was done in 1503 by one of the most illustrious artists, Leonardo da Vinci. And the idea is for the artist to see how to merge the past with the present. And is using this popular image to preach the essence of using face mask. And what this goes to say is that the subject, it made the subject of use of face masks very, very important. It made the subject very, very stronger. And this is one of the creative way of passing one's thoughts, one's feelings across. And this is exactly what this artist has done by expressing his creativity. Another form of creativity was expressed by Dotun Popola. Dotun Popola is a metal sculptor, and he tried to depict the coronavirus in its art form using metal and using colors. And of course, we know that coronavirus is not visible, but with this artwork, we can see it, we can feel it, and we can even see the effect that it creates, on looking at it. And what the artist is trying to do is to use his art to document historical events. And that's one of the purposes of art, to use art to document events. And since this is going to go and come, this has come and it's going to go, there will be something to refer to later as one of the evidence of what has happened. So what this man is interested in through his creativity exactly is to ensure that he documents the coronavirus and for future generations to see what has really happened. Another expression of creativity is by Filani, and this is something that shows the story of the overwhelming presence of the virus. You know, the virus is invisible, but from this painting, you can understand that it is visible, it is overwhelming, it is filling the space, it is all over the place, and is over everybody. and nobody is safe, so to say. Everybody is vulnerable. And you can see both young, both old, male and female, they are in danger of the coronavirus. So what the actually is trying to pass across by this expression is to make us to realize that everybody is vulnerable and that this coronavirus is real and is there and is over everybody. Despite the fact that there is a coronavirus pandemic, the man who posted this, Ikorodu, is trying to express affection during the pandemic. Though there's pandemic, but there is expression of affection. We cannot say because there's pandemic, then life will not continue. No, life must go on. So here, this friend on Facebook posted an expression of affection that we see a newly wedded couple who are conscious of the presence of COVID-19 still get married because life must go on. And we can see their consciousness is shown from the medical face mask that they put on. So this person is saying that affection must continue. There are some things that must continue, even though there is a coronavirus. There must be affection, there must be love, there must be those other things that we are used to. And coronavirus may try to stop us from some of these things from happening, but they must still happen, even though in a low key, even though in a small fashion. And this is what the artist is trying to express. This is an expression of hope. Olatunbosun is a textile designer, and he uses this post to express hope to those who are his friends that these too shall pass away. You can see from his t-shirt, he writes, "These two shall pass away," while keeping safe, while covering his face and in a fashionable way. The material used for the face mask and the cap, they are the same thing, and it's trying to pass the facts. The prophetic gleam of hope to the people that there is going to be a relief in the face of despair, in the face of fear. That there will be a time that we'll look back and I'll be talking about coronavirus as something that has come and that has gone. And apart from this, we have another one that is talking about love, expression of love to heal the world. Derunke is also a textile designer, and he did this work to show to the world that there is need for us to spread love and not the virus. When you spread love, then that is the way to heal the world. It's an expression of love as something that can heal the world. So even from here, I'm expressing my love across to the world, that what we need to spread now is love and not the virus. And the only way we can heal the world, because the world is sick, because coronavirus has ravaged the world. And the only way we can overcome this is through love. So we should spread love during this pandemic so that we can heal the world. Now, let me go to the conclusion. You can see from all these expressions made by my friends on Facebook, artists and non-artists, they have tried to live up to the expectation by trying to cope by expressing themselves. And this shows that this crisis has led to a lot of demand on them, and they have expressed their feelings and thought. There are so many other ones, but these are just ones selected for this purpose. They have expressed their feeling and thoughts about the crisis, the way they feel about it. But one thing that is very important is that even during those periods, there were no way they could express themselves, because most time they were locked at home, and the only viable means was to use the social media. And in this case, they use a socially acceptable channel, which is Facebook, and they are able to express themselves about the coronavirus. And in line with Sigmund Freud's psychoanalysis, what this has done is to provide relief to them. And not only to them, it's also to provide relief for those who are their friends, who will get to read the post. And by doing this, all the despair and the fear that was created by the coronavirus were able to be, sublime. So this is not only offering an opportunity for sublimation of impulses, but it also help them to, it also help others who are also reading the post, to help them to, suppress other forms of inner thoughts and feelings, especially those that are negative during the period of the pandemic, especially when there was a lockdown. So before I end this lecture or this presentation, let me appreciate the friends on my Facebook, those whose posts, whose expressions have been found useful for this presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. That was absolutely beautiful. You have taught us a great deal, so I'm very, very grateful to you. I have so many questions, but just to begin with, could you very briefly, just to give us a little bit of background, is the lockdown that you've seen in Nigeria comparable to the ones we heard about last week in other parts of Africa? Is it about the same, would you say?
Yes, the lockdown is the same thing all over. And here, though it's not affecting all the states, but at the time, there are some states that were affected, especially in Lagos, which is the epicenter of the coronavirus, and other neighboring states. But later on, other states also joined to lockdown, and this was exactly the way it is, in other parts of the world. And people could not move about, only those who are providing essential services like food sellers, those providing medical attention and the rest that are allowed to move around.
I see. And we saw these beautiful pictures, really wonderful. But is this expression of artistic sensitivity, is it very, very strong in the visual arts? So this reaction to COVID-19, have we seen it in poetry and in music and in song and in other areas as well? How would you think about that?
Yes, in Nigeria, the visual art sector has been very active in the wake of the pandemic, and there have been a lot of reactions from artists in terms of creating works, doing works online, posting images that tries to document and talk about the issue of pandemic. So the artists, like the musicians, like the poets and the rest, they are also very, very active during the pandemic, and even up to now.
Thank you. Well, all these leads into our questions. So we have a question from Claire here, who says, how would you compare this kind of expression to the artistic representations in the early days of the HIV/AIDS epidemic? Do you think it's comparable?
Now, the only difference between this one and other expressions of the past is that these ones are posted on Facebook, and not all of them are artists. But this, if you look at where I talked about expression of creativity, those four people that I mentioned about, they are artists. And what they have done is to use their art to make a representation, of expression. When you talk about expression, it's not just about expressing your thought and feeling. It's coming out with representation of your feeling, your innermost feeling. And I think the artists that I've used, especially those that I talk about under expression of creativity, they did that. So it's comparable to what has been done in the time of HIV and even other, artists have always responded to all the things that happen in the society. So it's not limited to the time of HIV/AIDS alone. all the time, artists have always been responsive.
I see, because there's a kind of a question related to that here from Nath, and Nath says, how does this relate to the political leaders? I mean, can artists perhaps encourage political leaders to be equally creative? Is there a link or an opposition between politics and art in Nigeria?
No, and yes. But when I say yes, I think the artists in Nigeria, they have always tried to use their art to talk about what is happening, even in politics. And there are even the aspect of art in Nigeria that critique the government. Like cartoonists, they try to do works that talk about what is going on in the government. So the artists are really helping to shape things politically, even though the mode of expression is visual, but it's very, very strong. And they have always done that. And I believe that the political group in Nigeria, or the political power, the people in the power in Nigeria, they are very wary of the artists. They don't want the artists to talk about them because of the way the expression goes viral.
Mm. And in terms of the expression, I was very struck by the fact that they use an idiom frequently of universal humanism, which is of course extremely attractive, and even asks, is it usual, or why do the artists express hope and love in their work when perhaps they might express tension or poverty or inequality, or perhaps they do both? What do you think?
It depends on the artist, and of course, not everybody will. They will not do their works following the same direction. There will be that diversified way of giving their voice to what is happening.
Yes.
While some are trying to protest, some will be giving hope, and some will be teaching or communicating values and all of that. So all of them will not be doing the same thing. They'll be doing different things, but all of them will be expressing themselves.
Yeah, I follow. And we have another question here about the relationship between art and film this time, and how does the work that the artist is doing reflect in the work of filmmaking and the filmmaking world in Nigeria?
The filmmaking world in Nigeria cannot exist without art. The photography itself is art. Photography aspect of filmmaking is art. Then when you talk about set design, is art. Costume design, I mean, the costume that the artists put on when they are on stage is art. So art and film, they are interrelated.
Right. So in other words, some artists must work on the films at the same time as doing their private work. Yeah.
It may be that is their specialization, to work with the filmmakers. There are those who work in the television stations and the rest. There are those who work on their own. So artists are working in different sectors of the economy. Right.
And in choosing the work that you just showed now, was this just a small sample of something that you could have chosen from a much wider group? Was there any particular reason why you chose those ones in particular?
Well, I have over 100 images and posts that I collected especially during the lockdown. But I selected from all of this so that I can have variety of themes. The expressions comes in different forms. The one that express the future, the one that I selected. There are some that are similar in themes. I just selected those that are diverse so that I can really talk about all of them.
Yes, because Joy asks, these were wonderful. How could one share their work? What would one do to share it more widely with a wider audience?
Well, this depends on the artist and the audience that is looking at. And, these ones that I selected, are just those who express themselves through the Facebook platform. And there are other platforms that are all over the place, especially during the lockdown. There are so many efforts by so many organizations. We now have online gallery, online exhibition, and all of that. So the person that is asking the question should search for online gallery, online platforms that have been created, especially during the COVID-19, to where he or she can exhibit its work. There are so many of them out there.
Okay, that's very helpful. And Andrea, it goes back to the question of the fun of artists, and they ask, is it possible sometimes that artists can increase tension with their work rather than relieving them, for example, during the coronavirus?
Well, artists can do that, but it is not wise to do that during the coronavirus era, because the coronavirus itself is a novel tension. So what artists can do is to create sublimation of the tension. And if you are going to create any tension, it should be against the ruling class, not to create tension among the people, so that the ruling class will be on their toes.
Yes, I see. And how would you relate that to Freud's idea of sublimation? How I thought that was very interesting at the end.
Freud was saying that is a psychoanalysis theory of art, that when artists have something to express, something that is innermost to them, they express it. They cannot allow it to continue to bother them. So they find a way of expressing it through their artwork. And the moment they express it, they overcome the pressure and they become relieved, having expressed themselves. So that's what Freud was saying, that is a form of healing. It's a psychoanalysis way of healing the artist by making them not to cock up their expressions, but to express them so that they will be free. I mean, they will be okay. They will now get better.
Yes, I see. That makes it very clear. We have a very interesting comment here from Giovanna from Italy. And she says that art in Italy also played a very, very important role in relieving social tension. And it really was the most important use of art. I don't know whether you've seen the way art is used in other countries. That would be the first part of the question. But she also asked whether education has played a role, and the schools have played a role in Nigeria in the coronavirus outbreak.
Well, I'm very sure, because art is one language. So all over the world, wherever, they will be doing the same thing. But what I've just done is to select from Nigeria. I believe that artists are doing the same thing all over the world. It's a universal tool. And I think in Nigeria, there is education enough to inform the people about the coronavirus. And of course, now in Nigeria, the social media is very, very powerful. So if there is no enough education coming from the right quarters, there will be enough from the internet, from the social media. Only one has to be very careful, because there are also negative information or fake news, and this is just the problem. But I think people are well synthesized during this period of coronavirus.
Yes. And do you see the relationship between art and the ruling classes as being a national question or a universal question?
Is a universal question, because the artists are always against the ruling class, especially when the ruling class are not doing the right thing. So they do a lot of satire about what they are doing. They try to make and the message is even stronger. Message of expression through art, visual expression, is usually very stronger. So most times, and in the past in Nigeria, we have situation whereby artists, especially those that do cartoons, have to run for their life, because they are being chased by the people in power. So there is not always relationship in terms of cordiality, because the artists will always speak about those things that are not doing right. And most of the time, the political class, they are not always doing things right.
Yes. So the question here from Naz Mohammed, and he's wondering whether the expression of art is often from the less affluent people, the poor people, and therefore it can act as a useful tool of communication between the oppressed and the ruling class. What do you think about that?
Yes, I think that is right. That is so. Most of the time in our associations, we have encouraged ourselves to join the political class, to be part of the ruling class, but it's not always correct. It's not always right. And most of the time, the artists don't find themselves in the upper echelon in terms of the ruling class. So they're always in the middle and lower than the middle. And therefore, they are always fighting, for the less privileged or the masses.
And is that expression of consciousness experienced most of all in collectives or in art colleges or through individual artists influencing other artists? How would you see the social medium through which this protest is expressed?
The problem, I must say, with art in Nigeria is that it is very individualistic, because artists naturally are not conformist. So you hardly see a situation whereby artists will come together to fight the same cause. And more so, apart from it is individual, artists' creativity is also individual. So what I have to create may be different from what the other person has to create. So most times, artists on their own, they do it individually. But then there's nothing stopping artists to come together to do art for a particular purpose. But of course, artists have their specialization. Artists have what they do. The artists that do social images, the artists that do political images, the artists that do other things. So it's not really easy to make artists to do the same thing. Most times, because it is personal expression, they are always expressing themselves together. But when we put all of this together, it comes together as something that is very strong, as a good voice of the people.
So its strength comes from the way it's reflected in the wider population.
Yes, of course, yes.
Yes. Now there was another a question here. Yes, how do you see the long-term effect of COVID-19 among the both among the artists and among the population in Nigeria? Is this really going to have a profound effect on Nigerian society and upon art in Nigerian society?
It's already having profound effect in Nigeria. And like I said earlier, in this part of the world, those who are in a non-formal sector are many. And we have artists who are not working in other places. They are working on their own. And when people are struggling to eat, struggling to make ends meet, they may not be talking about patronage of art. So essentially, during this period, patronage of art, not only visual art, other forms of art has gone down. So the pandemic has a serious effect on the artists, on the entertainment industry, and on the non-formal sector of the economy. Only those that are good to go, so to say, now are those who are in paid employment.
Yes, which leads us into the question by Marasuka, and they ask, do you know how Nigerian artists and other creative people who do not have access to the internet how can they express their ideas and feelings about COVID-19?
For artists, mostly artists have access to the internet. No matter how small, artists most times have access to internet. But that is not to say that all the artists have access. There are a few artists that may not have access. And there are so many people that do not have access. Those who do not have smartphones, you know, and all of that. So I'm saying that there are people that do not have access to internet. So those part of the population may be suffering from information deficiency. But I think this is even dangerous because they get information from other sources that will have been altered in one way or the other. So I think as much as the government tries to improve on the problem of poverty, to improve, to remove poverty from the society, there will be more access to internet.
Yes, yes, and there's a question here from Sobranimiam, who asks what the impact is of these creative expressions in terms of awareness. And so, the government, of course, is talking about COVID-19 all the time, but perhaps the artists are more effective than the government in the way that they express these ideas to the people.
Yes, the government is trying to put together those in the entertainment industry to see how they can help, the people in this industry during this era. So the artists are really, they are having interaction with the government, especially all of those in the entertainment industry. But that is not going to be enough because we know that the population is much, and I believe that the government will not be able to help everybody. But I think they are trying in their own bits to do something about this.
Yes. So we're almost out of time, but it seems to me that artists in Nigeria have really important and multiple roles in society. Would you agree with that?
I agree with that. Artists are like prophets, like we have seen. Artists like they are crusaders. Artists are healers. Artists are communicators. Artists are historians. Artists serve so many dimensions of purpose in the society.
Well, thank you. That's a marvelous way now to turn to our general discussion, and we now welcome back Danny Miller to our deliberations.
Thank you.
Well, how does that fit into your project, Danny?
Oh, well, I was delighted with the paper. Thank you very much indeed. And indeed, the fact that it actually did precisely what I think my paper didn't do, which is bring out the response of people to what is going on. But actually, my comment on the paper would be really in relation to the importance of online here, because obviously at the present time, these images are circulating through Facebook. And I found the images in several instances quite reminiscent of memes that are shared now very widely. They often employ the same kind of fun, the same creativity. I mean, that image, even though it was on the street of the coffin, etc., is very similar to memes that I've seen circulating in Ireland. And I just want to suggest that maybe there's an additional element going on here. Because in our past project, we had this theory of the meme as what we call the moral police of the internet. That I think that what's often being expressed by the artists, but also much more widely by people sharing memes, is about morality. How should we judge the actions of people, what they're doing? Should they be hopeful? Should they be anxious? Should they be protesting? And these visual materials, I think it came out so well in this talk, these visual materials work very effectively in creating what I guess in anthropology we call normativity. What should you think about what's going on? And I think what's valuable about them is, you don't have to be very literate or you don't have to be writing. When you have these visual images, they can actually be shared very easily and are shared very widely. I can't think of a Facebook profile that I work with today that isn't just full and full of memes, kind of in the spirit, the genre, I think, of what was being discussed there.
Okay, thank you very much. Like I said, your paper also talks about the use of smartphones. And I think where we should be talking about now is the role that phone is playing in the in communication of realities in our society, because most of these posts are not done on a computer. They are done using so it's mobile. Wherever they go with their phone and they can express themselves. And also, the phone is also a means of, it's a camera whereby you can take pictures. And some of the expressions by artists, some of them are based on things that are happening in the environment. So when we look at it, for the use of phone and from the use of platforms such as social media platform, you cannot really do any policing, because one of the questions that people will ask here is that I bought this phone by myself. I bought the data. You did not buy the data for me. I purchased my phone and I have my data. And you cannot censor what I post. And you cannot also prevent people from expressing themselves. Gone are the days when you'll be listening to radios, you'll be listening to television, and you cannot respond. But now you can respond. If there's any piece of news, you are not okay with it, the next moment you express yourself through Twitter, through Facebook. And you can also pass some messages across your other platform like WhatsApp, and it becomes viral. So you cannot really police. There was a time in Nigeria where the government was trying to legislate against the use of, posting anything you like on the social media. The people fought against it and they stopped the legislation that for once, let people be free to express themselves. And again, you look at it, you cannot give a direction to what people can post on the internet. They will post all manners of things. And that is what my paper exemplifies. There will be those that are subtle, there will be those that are strong. They post all the things that they like. But where I am going, what I want to say is that for your paper and my paper, the synergy is that smartphones and the use of the applications, the use of the social media platform inside the smartphone will go a long way in shaping our society and in expressing ourselves.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I mean, I think I also expressed myself badly because I wasn't thinking of an external policing, because clearly not really possible unless you're very authoritarian, but rather the way people could show the value. So policing is like trying to make sure that other people obey the regulations about social distancing by showing a meme, or in your case, a work of art that, like with the coffin. What the coffin is doing is the policing I meant, that actually it's telling people, not only do other people say these are the values we have to have, but this coffin very powerfully makes that point. That's what's going to happen to you if you don't actually take these things seriously. And I think there we would be, very much in agreement about the effect of these, and the fact that, as you just said, you really can't deal with this anymore except by understanding it through the medium of things like social media.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, any more questions from the audience who would like to ask a question to both our speakers together, maybe? But just while people are thinking about that, we have another question for Kehinde here, which is, it says, an anonymous attendee asks, we know that dance and drama is part of the performing arts. And is it possible that dance can express some of these ideas, or is it just not possible?
Well, all the forms of art available, drama and other aspects of drama, dance drama, and all others, music and poetry, visual arts, all of them are strong enough to express. In fact, I can also say that dance drama is entertaining and it passes the information in a sublime way to the audience, even more than visual art. Visual art is only there. When you get there, you see it. But when you watch drama, you can laugh, you can interact, and do all that. But that is not saying that it's stronger than visual art. But all of the art, they are strong tools of passing information, of expression.
Yes. Yes. But I wonder whether it seems to me that this is actually why Danny's work is so very, very important, because none of this would be possible without the huge explosion in the kind of social media that he's been exploring. So it kind of answers the question that was put forward earlier, which is whether we can do anthropology anymore without taking into account visual anthropology. And this is a good example, or visual media is a good example of where we simply couldn't do this kind of anthropology without doing so. Don't you think so, Danny?
Yeah, I mean, I think if the best example of that is probably photography. I mean, photography has changed out of all recognition. It used to be something special and rare, and now it's essentially part of communication. And I think that's where these two papers come together, is particularly that if you think about how human communication itself has been transformed, effectively it used to be essentially oral or textual. But with the rise of social media, the visual becomes a form of conversation, not just communication, conversation. And the area that I work with, the Snapchats and the memes, etc., it's just a constant of everyday life. You're constantly circulating these images and you're using them in a conversational way. So yes, I think to not engage with this online is in a sense to render yourself without one of the senses, as though you're not going to look at actually where most of the visual material is actually being circulated, because you can't speak a picture, and that's why it wasn't, when we anthropologists said, oh, we're going out and listening to what people said, we didn't think we were listening to pictures. But as this paper just showed, we want to listen to pictures, and pictures speak far more now through the medium of these platforms, because they are absolutely full of visuality. And I think it's changed human communication, and to that extent, yes, surely it's changed what anthropologists have to be engaged with and aware of when they're doing their fieldwork.
And there's a question here actually about the material culture of all this for Kehinde. The mobile phones that everybody is using, is that linked to the international online trade in Africa? The phones flooding in. Where do they all come from? Is basically the questions here.
The phones.
Do you want to go
talking about the phones? Come again.
Sorry. Well, okay, I can also respond. In our work, most of the ones actually coming into Africa for a larger population would be Chinese. Companies like Techno, they'd be available for, at least in Uganda, they're available for around £12.50 for a smartphone at the very lowest level, which is why they are becoming a very, very common device. And the impact of that, I mean, you'd see, particularly in the development of things like mobile money, which has become hugely important in terms of how money circulates in the area, let alone wider trade. So smartphones, elite smartphones might be for elites. We're not talking about iPhones and Samsung, etc. But these cheap Chinese phones, they now, I think, do reach a mass audience. Is that true in Nigeria, in Lagos?
Yes, in Lagos, we have a lot of phones, or in Nigeria, from China, like you said, and Techno is one of them. So there are so many phone brands from across, I mean, from all over the world, but mostly from China.
Yeah.
And a further question here from Catherine for both our speakers. And she says, could you please talk about taboos and new taboos and COVID-19? So, for example, in Nigeria, is art a space where COVID-related taboos can be discussed? And for example, to Danny, are there taboos related to surveillance? And she gives or where taboos can be amplified, confirmed, or challenged. And she gives an example and says, well, in Belgium, apparently, people apparently don't want to transmit more than 2 or 4 names of people with whom they've been in touch. So there we are, a question for both of you.
Well, taboo is very strong in Africa, and is even in the in as regards COVID, there are some taboos that have been observed, you know, and of course, when you lock down and you are not asked to, you cannot go out, and there have been such taboo in the past that don't go out at such a time. So we see this as something that is also related to those taboos. And they also believe in some space in Nigeria that this COVID is spiritual, and that you can carry sacrifices and make all forms of propitiation, and this will happen. Even though we are made to believe that this is a medical problem, but there are still people who believe that it is spiritual, and that you can make use of local means of warding off the coronavirus. So taboo is there. It's going to continue to be part of the culture of the people. But with education, with enlightenment, with exposure, they are being reduced by the day.
Thank you. I mean, the question was asking me particularly about issues of privacy, and certainly I think that privacy constitutes taboo in the way that was just said. In other words, there's lots of people that would say it is simply not acceptable to pass on certain kinds of information, and that is taboo, and that varies from society to society depending on what the importance of privacy is. I guess I would think actually that there's another level to this, which is maybe this is not the case at all, but I felt that actually the critique of privacy itself that I was trying to promulgate in the talk was intended, as it were, to actually address a taboo. In other words, I'd certainly had the feeling that it's become almost unacceptable to make the case that privacy essentially is quite commonly a form of harm. And that is because it has become kind of enshrined and had almost this, I was implying it has almost this quasi kind of, I use the word cult, quasi-religious sensibility, which would be like, but if everyone's comfortable, then obviously I was wrong about that and it's just fine. But certainly in other encounters I've had, the vehemence of response has suggested that there is something of the taboo about when you're trying to critique what's going on around poverty.
Yes, thank you. And there's a related question there, which is one of our audience says, could you please expand a little bit on what you mean by the expression "people is infrastructure"?
People? Who's expression?
Well, apparently he used the expression "people is infrastructure." I didn't hear you use it myself, but perhaps that was a misunderstanding.
No.
Oh, I see. Well, never mind. Then we'll just move on to the next question, which is age related, and really to both of you, how do you see the different generations fitting into the analysis that you've given today? I mean, perhaps will this the anthropological analysis during this COVID-19 time mean that we as anthropologists become more sensitive to generational differences in the way people are reacting to these things?
I mean, I think that's a very helpful question, because I do think it addresses something, how should I put it, that has become something of a taboo. That is to say, in most of the work of our project is about aging. And we argue there has been a major transformation in certainly the subjective experience of aging, in that people who used to be were comfortable being thought of as elderly or seniors, and just not anymore. They see themselves much more in terms of continuity. You know, when they reach 70, 80, they thought something was going to change. They'd be like, you know, Beatles said, with their rocking chairs. But it's not like that. There is a radical transformation that really has changed from age as structural and, in a sense, age as biological, because of the repudiation of the way society had almost imposed age as what we call a social construct. Now, the COVID-19 really does have a major impact on this, because you're trying to get away from this kind of structuring of society around entrenched categories of age, and along comes something that is very, very clearly age related. And I think it something that isn't really being spoken about, and I think it would take a lot to investigate this, is there was already quite a lot of resentment, I think, by younger people against what's been happening amongst older generations, because of things like the concentration of assets. You know, the young people can't afford housing, they don't have the same opportunities, they don't think that they are going to be able to live the kind of lives they see that their parents were enabled to live. And then along comes something where I think many young people do not feel this virus is as dangerous for them, because for most people it isn't. For some it will be, but for most people it isn't. So I think it is very likely that this exacerbates what was already there as a potential tension, intergenerational tension, which cuts right across the actual transformation of aging itself, because age is both what you feel like inside and how other people see you. So the changes that have been going on with the subjective feeling of aging, which has gone in one direction, is kind of countered by what other people see this age group as being. And I suspect there is and will be resentment of sequestering that's seen almost as though it's on behalf of the older people. And clearly there are voices out there who just wish older people would just stay at home and let the rest of the world, you know, get on with life, because you know, they're the cause of the problem, because they are the victims of this. So it's hard to get, you know, how to investigate this, how do you research it, how do you actually know what people are thinking about it. But I think there are reasons in the logic of what is going on to expect that this is going to have consequences.
I agree with you that it's going to have a lot of consequences, and you have said it very clearly. The aging is also very obvious in the way things are done, in the things that the younger people are interested in. And also, like you said, the older ones, they are the cause of most of the problems that the younger ones are facing. So, and with the explosion, especially in this part of the world, of the use of smartphone, younger people are seeing what is happening all over the place, what is happening, across the world, and they know what they want, and they have a view of what they want to do. And what I'm saying is that the issue of age becomes something that is going to continue to be relevant in terms of how people look at situations of things that is going on around them.
Well, now sadly we're out of time, but we've had an absolutely wonderful afternoon. So thank you so much for joining us from Nigeria, Kehinde, and we look forward to talking more in the future. And thank you very much, Danny, for joining us from London. So there we are. So I now hand back over to Hanyin and Emma and say goodbye to everybody. And thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, and thank you for visiting our webinar.